From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Gerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal. I'm Gerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. Thank you very much for joining us. If you're not already subscribing, please do subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you do your podcast listening. And remember, please, to leave us a nice review. This week, we have war once again in the Middle East. Maybe war has never really stopped in the Middle East over the last 30, 40 years, or 50, or even 60 or 70 years or so, I suppose. But of course, we are witnessing these remarkable scenes right now. I'm recording this Monday afternoon. We're about 3 or 4 days into Israel's extraordinarily effective attack on Iran, on its nuclear facilities, on its defense systems, obviously on its leadership. Remarkable success in taking out some of both the military and intelligence and other leadership. But once again, Israel demonstrating its extraordinary might. Of course, it hasn't been without cost. Iran has retaliated, has fired back, and some of its missiles have got through into Israel and have resulted in some significant number of casualties there. But what's Israel trying to achieve? Well, we know, of course, this has been the long-standing goal of Israel and, of course, of the United States to essentially to get Iran to end, voluntarily or otherwise, its nuclear program. Israel finally deciding that both the timing and the opportunity was right to strike at Iran's nuclear capability. And so far, as they seem to have enjoyed considerable success. But as we also know, it has been widely reported that as much damage as Israel can and has been able to do and is able to do to Iran's nuclear program, it may not be able, given the defenses that Iran has, particularly at its facility buried deep in Fordo in Iran, that Iran may not yet have seen the complete destruction of its nuclear capability. And indeed, there are many who argue that that couldn't happen without the United States taking part, joining Israel. And so far, at least, while the US has clearly been offering logistical support and supply support, and indeed political and diplomatic support, there hasn't yet been a clear willingness by the United States to directly assist Israel in this attempt to degrade and destroy the nuclear program. So, as I say, this extraordinary assault by Israel goes on. And we're going to look at this today, look at how this came about, look at the success so far of what Israel's done, look at some of the challenges Israel faced, and more importantly, try to get a sense of where all this fits in to the wider geopolitical realities in the Middle East. How much damage is Iran, which has already faced multiple setbacks across the region, how much further damage this is doing to it, how this might change the entire puzzle, as it were, and the balance of power in the Middle East. And I'm delighted to say that I've got my old friend and friend of the podcast back to discuss this, Marc Reuel Gerecht, who's a writer, political analyst with extensive experience writing about the Middle East, particularly about Iran, but also about Arab countries. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. He's written a lot about Islamic militancy, counterterrorism, and other aspects of the region. Early in his career, a few years ago, Marc Reuel was a case officer at the CIA working on Middle Eastern affairs. And I'm delighted to say that Marc Reuel Gerecht joins me now. Reuel, thanks very much for joining Free Expression.
Thank you very much.
Reuel, as long as I've known you, which is more than 20 years, you've been, many things, but you've been talking about and writing about the threat from Iran, the threat particularly from Iran's nuclear program, how the West deals with this, how Israel deals with it, how the United States deals with it. We finally seem to have entered a really genuinely kinetic phase of that long process last week with Israel's launch of these strikes against Iran and what now seems to be a kind of an engagement between the two. We're recording this Monday afternoon. We're into about the third or fourth day of this. Give me your sense, Reuel, if you will, just how you assess the Israeli operation so far, what its objectives are, what it's achieving.
Well, I mean, first I would say the extent of the Israeli operations are astonishing. I had not expected them to do this. I was talking with Israeli officials last week, and they certainly gave the impression that something was coming that way. I had a bit of skepticism about this, in particular Bibi Netanyahu, who had walked up to this a few times and then walked away from it. But I think they've been more or less honest about what they're going after. They're first and foremost have tried to neutralize the immediate threat, immediate nuclear and ballistic missile threat. They appear to have done that at Natanz and certainly blowing up the facility at Isfahan, which is responsible for making the uranium plates and an implosion device. They may have knocked out the electricity and damaged the cascades at Fordo. It's not clear. They've also gone after the leadership and knocked out, I think, most of the leadership of the Guard Corps and in the intelligence services of the Guard Corps. You know, there is an aspect to this which the Israelis, at least privately, make explicit, and that is they are after a regime change. Now, whether you can pull that off from the air is a different question, but I think they are trying to humble the entire ruling apparatus of the Islamic Republic, and I don't expect them to stop until they have taken out most of the component parts.
As you say, we've seen just extraordinary Israeli intelligence, military capability. We've seen that, by the way, over the last couple of years, but we're seeing it again playing out here.
I would emphasize, I think it's a remarkable turnaround. One could make an argument that Mossad in the 1990s, up in the early 2000s, maybe date that at least up to the assassination of Mahmoud al-Mabhouh in Dubai, which went badly awry. It revealed sort of that the Mossad had sort of lost the ABCs of basic operations. That one could question Mossad's competence. I think after what we've seen in Lebanon against the Hezbollah, and even more so in Iran, you can no longer question it. I think they have demonstrated that they are the most accomplished intelligence service, both in the collection of human intelligence and in covert action in the world. It is a truly impressive turnaround.
So what I was going to say was, they have just exceeded, I think, even perhaps the most kind of optimistic assessments and everything we've seen in the last year and a half. The thing that's been a constant, that whenever anybody has talked about the limitations and the feasibility of what Israel can achieve in striking Iran, well, I guess there have been a couple of things. One is, it was always argued, I'm never sure how true this was or to what extent this was misinformation, but that Israel would need support, maybe US support for refueling for its jets, given the long nature of the round trip. Well, that may or may not be true. But the other thing that's always definitely been talked about, and again, could be misinformation, and you mentioned the Fordo nuclear facility, that is sort of buried too deep underground, that Israel doesn't have the bunker-busting bombs, whatever you want to call them, to be able to reach that. And you've already talked about some of the damage that they've already done. And again, Israel, they still very publicly, I saw they said it again today, the leadership says they do need U.S. assistance in some of these targets. And again, given everything we've seen Israel been able to do in the last 3 days, how real is that need for the U.S.? Or is it more of a political, diplomatic asset that Israel wants from U.S. engagement? Or do you think they really do still need some hard military capability that they just maybe don't have themselves?
Well, they obviously need resupply. So that is without doubt that the Israelis can't continue a long-term bombing campaign against Iran unless they are assured of American supply. Concerning Fordo, I think the original Israeli plan was to actually attack it with commandos and to soften up the area and go in with commandos and try to get in that way. That may still be their plan. I know that when we had that leak in Washington, either from the White House or from Tulsi Gabbard over at DNI, that the director of national intelligence, that the Israelis were planning some type of commando operation against Iran. I suspect it was actually about the Fordo site, and certainly the Israelis were very upset about that leak. I think they wanted American assistance in that, probably logistical assistance to conduct that operation. Could they do that now, given the success they have had at knocking out Iran's air defenses all by themselves? Maybe. It's really a lift capacity of how many men they can get in and get out, and do they feel like they can do that securely with the aircraft, probably using Hercules that they have? I don't know. Certainly it would be easier if the Americans participated and used B-2 bombers and massive ordnance penetrator. I'm skeptical that Mr. Trump would lend them that support. I think it's still highly unlikely, but obviously Mr. Trump has many contradictory impulses, so I don't know. But they certainly need American assistance when it comes to defensive operations, and I believe that assistance assistance has been given. Whether it was given as exuberantly as it was given back in, say, October, when we had the last exchange of missiles, I don't know. It's not clear yet. Obviously, the Iranians have shot a lot more missiles, have shot bigger missiles at Israel this time, and the penetration rate is higher, hence the casualty rates in Israel.
Yeah, I was joking with someone earlier today that the Israeli intelligence has been so astonishingly good. We're probably going to actually find out soon that the entire leadership of the Iranian nuclear program are Israeli spies, and they're about to sort of sabotage the whole thing themselves. So if you think they do need US assistance, again, obviously you talk about supply and defensive, if this primary goal of degrading, seriously damaging Iran's nuclear capability, if they can only partly achieve that, but they really need US assistance to go sort of the whole way, as it were, what's your sense? Is it likely they would have gone ahead with this mission without believing that they were going to be able in the end to enlist the United States in it?
Yes. I think there actually was a change in calculations in Israel. Earlier, I think the Israeli view is they wanted to be able to destroy all of the program. And if they weren't able to destroy all of the program, then doing the operation wasn't worthwhile. I think October 7th changed that. You began to see a consensus develop whereby partial destruction of the Iranian nuclear program could produce success. It could delay it. And as long as the threat was of a long-term bombing campaign, as long as the Iranians were well aware, and they certainly are now, of how deeply they've been penetrated, and given the loss of personnel, both in the nuclear and in the ballistic missile programs, that the Israelis, even if they couldn't destroy all of Fordow, it would be a worthwhile effort. I think that's where they are now. That's the way they're operating. And I think if you also varnish on top of that their hopes, I can't gauge the depth of them, that this type of defeat for the Islamic Republic, for the theocracy, might be enough to crack the regime. I wouldn't be surprised if the Israelis really, in the beginning, had the intention of knocking off the supreme leader. I think it's fair to say, given what we've seen happen in Iran, that they probably had the intelligence to do so. So I do give credit to the stories that say that President Trump vetoed that.
So if that's true, what do you make of Trump's decision to veto that?
I think the president really does believe in the idea of still cutting some deal.
Right.
And if you eliminate Khamenei, then you have real confusion in the Islamic Republic. That's why the Israelis, I suspect, wanted to do it. They probably wanted to take out both Khamenei and Pezeshkian, the president, thereby leaving essentially the regime headless. And no doubt, you're not going to have a meeting of the Assembly of Experts to choose the next supreme leader while the Israelis are attacking. So it would cause enormous disorganization in the system. I mean, you've already got that, but I think it would be completely headless. But the president, I think, went the other way.
I want to talk a little bit more about the regime and its fragility or otherwise and what we may see happen. But again, we're recording this Monday afternoon. The Wall Street Journal has reported just in the last couple of hours, actually, that just 3 days or so into this, and there's sort of indications that the Iranians are kind of crying uncle already. The journal reports that the Iranians are putting out feelers through Arab countries and others to the United States and to essentially to try and call this off. But apparently on the condition that the US resume negotiations. How do you interpret this? Is this all just, it's obviously a sign of their weakness, I guess. Is it just a desperate attempt to drive a wedge maybe between the US and Israel? What would Israel accept now with these negotiations short of a complete deconstruction of Iran's entire nuclear program?
I think that's what the Israelis would demand, that you would have to see something like we saw in Libya. Of course, the Iranians know well.
What happened to Gaddafi? Hanging from a lamppost.
Yes, that's not a good scenario. Yeah. So, this is classic Khamenei. The man, though a devout revolutionary, has never been adverse to using diplomacy to further revolutionary interests. So given how badly they've been damaged, I wouldn't be surprised if he would send out feelers to both the Americans, the Europeans, to absolutely everyone, to try to get the Israelis to relent with the hope that, you could restart negotiations, they could lie, they could prevaricate, they could delay, and they would thereby use diplomacy to save themselves.
If the US doesn't contribute, I mean, as you say, it's already contributing in various ways. If it doesn't contribute, and if there isn't a kind of a more concerted attempt perhaps on the Fordow nuclear facility, from what you're hearing and talking to, how much more can we expect from Israel? They've talked about this being, I think publicly, they've talked about it being a 1 to 2 week campaign. What would your expectations be over the next few days?
I mean, I would expect it to at least be a couple of weeks, and then it really depends upon what the Israelis pick up through their intelligence networks. So they're going to be listening to see whether the Supreme Leader, members of the Guard Corps who are still alive, have decided that they now need to do what they should have done a long time ago, and that is make a mad rush to the bomb. Whether they're able to do that, whether they still have the machinery to do that, whether they can get access to enough highly enriched uranium and turn it into metal plates, I don't know. But this is what obviously Mossad's going to be listening for and looking at, and if they detect any renewed activity, I'm sure they're going to go after it quickly and fiercely.
I mean, what's your sense again, and what's the intelligence telling us about, it's obviously been one of the key questions for years now with Iran, but how far away they are from really genuinely being able to weaponize what they have and to put it on a warhead? I mean, is any sense at all of how close that is?
You know, it really comes down to how far they'd gotten and how confident they were at developing an implosion device, a nuclear initiator. And we know that they were working on it, beyond a shadow of a doubt. The Israelis have given the impression that they now have sources in the nuclear inner circle. It's difficult to gauge that. Unless you actually see the intelligence, it's impossible to know whether they're telling the truth or they're exaggerating a bit. They give the impression that the Supreme Leader had, in fact, given the green light to move forward with deploying, developing, constructing a bomb. And that's one reason that they wanted to go now.
Yeah.
Again, you have to see it to know it. All we know for sure, based on what was collected by the Israelis when they raided the archive, what they have from sources, what the IAEA has shown us, is that the Iranians had been increasingly experimenting with essentially all the aspects of developing the bomb. We know that they have obviously spent a lot of money on developing the ballistic missiles. So it's hard to give a timeline. We know that they could take 60% enriched uranium and ramp it up to 90%, which is, the official bomb grade. They could do that in 3 days. But beyond that, I certainly don't have a good feel for how far they were from actually getting a working device.
What are the Russians and the Chinese making of this, Reuel, do you think right now? We know the Russia-Iran relationship, we know has been important in many ways. There's been lots of good documented evidence that Iran has been helping Russia in its war in Ukraine. We know also that, a lot of the apparently not very effective or now, shall we say, discontinued defenses that Iran has counted on, a lot of those were Russian built. So we know just how close that relationship has been. I mean, again, let's start with Moscow. What do you think Putin's thinking here? He's obviously, he lost one close ally next door in Syria just recently. How does he respond to this? How does he handle this publicly? Russia has denounced Israel, but how do you think he handles what is obviously another very, very, very bad setback for one of his big allies in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think Putin has downgraded Iranian utility. So obviously the Iranians are less valuable than they used to be. I think that's true for the Chinese. I would remark that back before, just around the same time that the nuclear negotiations started under Barack Obama, Putin had quipped to a senior European official, who I'll leave nameless, that he didn't really worry about the Iranian nuclear program because he thought in the end the Israelis would bomb it.
Right.
So I believe that statement actually to be true. And so I think what has happened is what Putin had predicted. I would also add, I think Putin probably changed his mind in that he really did view the Iranian nuclear program as a plus, not a minus. But I think it's fair to say there's never been a lot of love between Putin and the Iranians. The Iranians, quite correctly, always thought the Russians were abusing them. I think they saw a greater long-term utility in the relationship with China. But obviously, China doesn't have the wherewithal to be a player in the Middle East, not yet.
So you don't really see any real possibility of Russia I don't mean obviously sort of militarily, but Russia in any way trying to kind of use its power to, I mean, it's obviously got other things on his mind right now.
I think the biggest result probably in that triumvirate would be that Iran is much more supplicant now, and that China is going to demand even greater cuts in the price of oil.
We'll take a short break there. When we come back, I'll have more with Reuel Gerecht on Israel's war against Iran and what it may mean more broadly for the politics, the geopolitics of the region, and indeed of the world. Stay with us.
You're listening to Free Expression with Gerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Gerry Baker.
Welcome back. I'm speaking with Reuel Gerecht, writer, commentator, analyst of Middle Eastern affairs, and we're talking about the fight between Israel and Iran after Israel launched its attack at the end of last week on Iran's nuclear capabilities and indeed on Iran's broader defense capabilities. Let's talk about Iran, the regime there. You know it very well. You've been studying it for many, many years, coming up for almost 50 years since the revolution. You have extensively written about how unpopular the regime is. We've seen these repeated sort of insurgent movements and repeated sort of kind of proto-revolutionary movements that have been put down by their enemies. Just to take the sort of the obvious and simple question first, obviously always on people's minds when something like this happens is, does this weaken the regime or does it strengthen it? Do people say, as much as they may absolutely hate the mullahs, they're no fans of Israel either, and whatever happens, they don't want to see their country blown to smithereens by the Israelis. Does it weaken the regime or does it maybe actually lead to some kind of rallying around of it?
Oh, I think it weakens the regime. I think the regime thinks it weakens the regime. I mean, Khamenei in particular always sees foreign domestic threats as intertwined. He views it as a giant moving conspiracy against which he has been fairly talented in stopping, oppressing. So I think his primary concern now is where is the Revolutionary Guard Corps going? Because after the debacle in Lebanon with the Hezbollah, you started seeing open Republican Guard Corps voices suggesting the supreme leader had made a mistake in how he had approached developing nuclear weapons, and that they should have developed them sooner, and that if they'd done so, the Hezbollah would still be with us. That viewpoint obviously has to be more intense now. So I think the supreme leader, who's 86 years old, probably privately already has plans for his succession, is deeply concerned about how he handles what's left of the Guard Corps leadership. And I suspect he has to try to appease it. And he might want to anyway. They may be in sync philosophically, which I suspect means they have to try to figure out if they still have the means to develop a nuclear weapon. But he has no illusions about the street. I mean, we've got a lot of information about how the regime actually views the citizenry, and it's quite clear that they are deeply concerned that you could have another massive protest movement. Now, could Israeli actions, if they start to kill a large number of Iranian citizens, change that equation? Yeah, it's possible. I don't think it changes it for long. I mean, the hatred they have for the regime is every single day, and it's been for years. It's been growing. You don't see the type of movements that you've seen in Iran, which at times have approached insurrections. I don't think that goes away just because the Israelis have decided to strike back. So I'm skeptical the regime will get much mileage out of this, even if the Israelis make mistakes and bomb something, and kill a lot of citizens or children. But I don't think the regime gets saved that way. Obviously, it's going to play up that propaganda as much as it possibly can, and I would expect Iran's apologists elsewhere to play it up.
From the implication of what you're saying, it sounds as though there isn't really a succession plan, and given that Khamenei is old and reportedly pretty sick, I think last time you and I talked about this was probably a year ago, and the rumors were then that he was pretty seriously sick. Unless he's got a sort of secret succession plan, does the uncertainty about the succession, given how frail and how close to the end Khamenei might be with or without Israeli targeting, is that also a signal of the sort of fragile nature of the regime, that it's not even clear what the leadership would be next?
Absolutely. I think the succession from Khamenei was going to be a potentially convulsive moment in the Islamic Republic. under normal circumstances, because at that moment, all the various networks, which are almost like mafias inside of the Islamic Republic, were going to go at it. Unless the supreme leader, who's been very cagey about in naming a successor, I think because from the moment he did so, his own power would diminish, may have a great deal of difficulty given the failures that have occurred. I mean, before October 2023, I think it's a decent argument you can make, I certainly made it, that Khamenei was the most accomplished Middle Eastern dictator since World War II. Because of what has happened since October 7th, 2023, you can't make that argument. I think he has seen absolutely everything abroad and a lot at home unravel, and particularly the nuclear program, which he personally has husbanded through, I would argue, 1989, 1990, when it became more serious. 1992, people often say, is where it really took off, but it's been his child, and he may have now lost it, in addition to everything else. So he's in a very bad situation, and I suspect he hasn't yet figured out how to get out of it. And what his primary concern now, which explains the diplomatic outreach, is how to stop the Israelis from bombing them.
It is extraordinary, Reuel, isn't it? The dramatic loss of Iranian authority and power in the world and in that region. Again, I can remember talking to you over the just even in the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, obviously before October 7th, Iran's tentacles, whether it was in Syria, whether it was in Iraq, obviously with the government there, whether it was with the Houthis, whether it was some of the other Shia Arabs, and of course, whether it was through Hamas and through Hezbollah. You looked at this, Iran was the kind of rising power, the dominant power. And one of the reasons many people were so critical of the JCPOA, the deal that Obama initially signed, was that it actually seemed to reinforce this power that Iran had. And we've seen literally every single one of those vectors of Iranian power from, maybe not Iraq, but from Syria to Hezbollah to Hamas, and of course to its own defensive and offensive capabilities. Just in the space of 2 years, we've seen that just collapse, right? I mean, it's an extraordinary turnaround.
Oh, it is. There have been few rivals, I think, to the speed of the collapse of Iranian interests. Khamenei, with senior members of the Guard Corps, had perfected imperialism on the cheap. They had been able to deploy an axis of resistance, a ring of fire around Israel. They'd often intimidated the United States. They had moved forward on their nuclear program. They'd gotten Obama essentially to guarantee that they could have an industrial-sized nuclear program through the JCPOA. The restraints were short-term. They'd spooked the Gulf countries. They'd finally gotten great power patronage with Russia and China. I mean, everything was looking up. And then the Israelis pushed back, and we discovered that, the system, the apparatus, the superstructure that Khamenei had built did not have solid foundations and could not withstand hard power.
How are the Arabs looking at this? And you probably know, I'm sure you've spoken to some of them right now. I mean, because again, no love lost, obviously, as we well know, between the Persians and the Arabs. And yet we have seen a bit of a rapprochement in the last couple of years. We have seen the rapprochement through the Abraham Accords that Israel was reaching with some of the Arab countries. We've seen that a little bit set back by what Israel's been doing with Gaza and some of the tensions there. So where are we in that narrative? Are the Arabs here looking on with delight to see Iran weakened in this way and potentially even this regime destroyed in this way? Or are they got a wary eye on Israel and worrying that maybe, especially in terms of their own people, maybe an all-powerful Israel in the region isn't great news for them either?
The Saudis and the Emiratis are not exactly portraits in courage. So privately, they're thrilled that the Iranians' regime may be gutted. They are certainly always worried that it won't happen and that the Iranians will rise up again and get even. And the Gulfies instinctively know that in the head-to-head battle, regardless of all the weaponry the United States sells the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, that the Iranians will win. So it's just a reflex, and it's probably justified. But, I think they're going to keep their head down, and they're going to be happy that the Iranians haven't let loose yet any missiles or drones against their oil infrastructure. They are probably deeply nervous about Donald Trump still, because I think we always need to remember that what happened in 2019, where the U.S. did not come to the rescue of Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, when the Iranians attacked with cruise missiles and drones against oil infrastructure and shipping, that was a fairly decisive moment. And I would argue that it was the moment where MBS decided to regain traditional Saudi distance from the United States and to seek other partners, and that primarily the Chinese. So I don't think that goes away. I think there is a concern in the region, which is lasting, that the American retrenchment is real, that you're not going to see the reassertion of American hegemony in the region, and that Israeli hegemony simply isn't a replacement for that the Israelis aren't going to bleed for anybody in the Gulf. They will look after themselves, but they simply have no interest to try to project their power into the Persian Gulf. And as you pointed out, I think MBS in particular probably has doubts about his own population of whether that's a brilliant idea to get too close to the Israelis. I was of the view that the Saudis were never really that close to signing the Abraham Accords, that for MBS, it's not a win-win situation. He's fine the way it is, where he has almost open dealings with the Israelis, but he doesn't have to see the Star of David flying in Riyadh.
Yeah. All right. Just give us, and again, it's an absurd exercise to talk about the historical significance of something, even as it's unfolding. But we have seen all the reasons you've just described. We've seen this extraordinary last 2 years, this extraordinary assertion of Israeli power, of Israeli authority, the decline of Iranian power and authority in the region. And again, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know whether they're going to succeed in destroying the nuclear capabilities. We don't know how far that's going to go. Maybe that threat will still be there. But looking ahead to the next year, 2 years, 3 years, where does all this leave? It seems like Israel is is much more secure than it's been, perhaps at any time in the last 50 years. It seems that Iran is significantly weakened. Maybe that probably is overall good news for the Arabs. And as you said, but perhaps most importantly, the US does seem to be in this process of disengagement. What's your early assessment of where all this leaves the Middle East in terms of who holds the whip hand there and what it all means, particularly what it means for the United States?
Well, I mean, historically, since the 10th century, there have really the dominant peoples of the Middle East have been the Iranians and the Turks. There was a brief interlude started in the 1950s, where the Arabs thought once again they could be a major player. I don't take that credibly. The dominant forces in the Middle East are the Iranians, the Turks, and now you'd have to include the Israelis. I would expect the biggest beneficiary from Iranian defeat, and if this military defeat, and I think that's what you have to call it, if it has long-lasting repercussions, if it, for example, even in a shorter midterm, takes down the Islamic Republic, I think it's a fair bet that Iran's going to turn inwards. It's going to have to do that to see if it even survives as a nation state, because of all the various component parts inside Iran that, never really love each other. That's a question of how they hate each other, but they don't love each other. But I would expect Iran to turn inward and not to be a significant player. That would leave the Israelis and the Turks. So, and if, Erdogan's getting old, he's sick too, but it's possible that his reorientation of Turkey towards the Middle East will outlast him. And if that's the case, then I would expect the future of the Middle East to be largely carved out by the Israelis and the Turks, and I would expect the Gulf Arabs to play a minor role. I just don't think they believe that they have the wherewithal, the national confidence and strength to become major players. MBS has tried to reorient Saudi Arabia to turn it into sort of a modern Middle Eastern dictatorship, and to use nationalism in a way that they used to use Islam. Count me skeptical about whether that works. But even if it does, I don't think Saudi Arabia has the hard power capacity, and that's always the most important issue in the Middle East, has the hard power capacity to really play in the big leagues. So if this leads to the Islamic Republic being gutted or even felled, then I would say you would look towards the Turks and the Israelis to define the future, certainly in the northern Middle East and perhaps even further south.
I remember just a little anecdote. The one occasion on which I met King Abdullah of Jordan a few years ago, he told me that in his view, the future of the region would be determined to some extent by whether or not Erdogan was successful in remaking the Ottoman Empire. And it sounds as though you agree with him, and that now may be one of the sort of defining aspects of the region.
I mean, as you know, the Turks are a real force. It's just historically they have, since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, they've not aimed it back towards the Muslim world, but Erdogan's tried to change it. I do not know whether that change will outlast him. I suspect it will, because the Europeans aren't going to change their view, which is that there are too many Turks in Europe already.
We've got Putin trying to be Peter the Great and Erdogan trying to be Usman. So whoever says history isn't fascinating. Marc Reuel Gerecht, thank you very much indeed for joining Free Expression.
My pleasure.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Free Expression. Thanks very much for joining us. Please do join us again next week when I'll be back with another episode. In the meantime, have a great week. Thanks for joining us, and goodbye.